Welcome, everyone. Today it's Tuesday, July 9th, and we're here for the Why Do You Vote Social Action Campaign. This is a fiscally sponsored project of Money Out, Voters In. And the heart of the campaign focuses on 7 issues that actually have majority support by Americans: marriage equality, women's making choice about their own bodies, reducing the effects of climate change, background checks of gun sales, universal access to healthcare, the influence of money in politics as a major threat to our democracy, and that we need honest and fairly run elections open to all citizens. So with that, I would love to welcome John Bonifaz, the co-founder of Free Speech for People, who's been doing amazing work both on voting issues and getting big money out. Our voting topic is, honest and fair elections open to all Americans, and our democracy topic from our campaign is specifically about getting big money out because it is such a threat to our democracy. So welcome, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly, so much, and great to be with all of you. As Holly has mentioned, my name is John Bonifaz. I'm the president of Free Speech for People. We are a national, nonpartisan organization dedicated to fighting for our democracy and our Constitution all across the country. We were launched on the day of the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in Citizens United, the FEC, in January of 2010, with a campaign to overturn that ruling with a constitutional amendment, making clear that corporations are not people and money does not equal speech. We continue to be very supportive of that fight for a constitutional amendment. And on our website, we have what we see as the newest version of that model amendment, which we call the Free and Fair Elections Amendment that Congressman Jim McGovern has championed in the U.S. Congress. In addition to that, I should say that we also have been advancing, with many of you on this call, model legislation to end foreign influence corporate spending in our elections. And here we are trying to deal with is the threat that's emerged after Citizens United, with foreign investors now being able to subvert existing federal law that bars foreign nationals from spending money directly or indirectly in our elections. And they're able to do so through the corporate form because of a loophole created by Citizens United. Now that corporations can make expenditures from their general treasury funds, that means that foreign investors can effectively influence the expenditure of corporate general treasury funds in U.S. elections. And so this model legislation is designed to close that loophole. It defines a foreign influence corporation as one that has either 1% single stock ownership of a company or 5% in the aggregate. And it prohibits altogether that foreign influence corporation from spending money in U.S. elections. Now, that may sound low in terms of the thresholds for defining a foreign influence corporation, but in fact, if you are a 1% single stock owner of a multinational corporation, you have hundreds of millions of dollars of shares of that company. You're able to get the CEO on the phone. You're able to introduce a shareholder resolution. You're able to influence the decision-making around political expenditures in our elections. Similarly, the 5% in the aggregate is, I think, a clear indication of significant foreign influence. So we have been working with partners on this call and allies all across the country to advance this legislation. Has now been enacted in the state of Minnesota, in Seattle, where we work closely with Cindy Black and Fixed Democracy First for that victory in January 2020, and in San Jose, California. And it has been introduced in many other legislatures, including in California, where we've worked closely with Moby, of course, on that campaign. The Washington State Senate, the Hawaii State Senate, the New York State Senate have all passed this bill. And then the Pennsylvania House of Representatives just recently passed this bill with strong bipartisan support, 24 Republicans joining 102 Democrats in passing that bill. It is also in U.S. Congress been championed by Congressman Jamie Raskin and will very soon be reintroduced in the U.S. Congress. I'm not able to say more right now, but that will happen very soon, and we're thrilled to see it further advanced at the federal level as well. This will end the influence of corporate spending from 98% of the S&P 500, all of which have significant foreign influence. This is about preserving American self-government as distinct from the question of preventing corruption and the appearance of corruption. And it is grounded in a case known as Blumen v. FEC, which came out 2 years after Citizens United, where the Supreme Court upheld the long-standing prohibition that foreign nationals have no role in our elections. And that decision that the Supreme Court upheld was written by then Judge Kavanaugh of the DC Circuit when it came before his panel, and it was focused on preserving American self-government. So this is the constitutional basis for this legislation. We still believe we need a constitutional amendment ultimately to overturn the Citizens United ruling, but this model legislation is critical reform to blocking foreign influence in our elections. We also, I will just add one other point and turn it back over to you, Holly, is we've been also active in working to abolish super PACs. It is actually a misunderstanding that Citizens United created super PACs. That ruling did not. Super PACs were created by a federal appellate court ruling out of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit known as Speech Now v. FEC. It's never been reviewed by the U.S. Supreme Court. And we and many others in the legal community believe that that ruling was wrong and that you should not be able to circumvent existing contribution limits by making unlimited donations to PACs and thereby creating super PACs. So we continue to be active on that front as well in vehicles to help revisit that ruling and abolish super PACs. Thank you.
Thank you for all that great information, John, and that's great. We could add some more information on this, on all of this stuff in our shared Google Doc so that you can come back to it later, because we want people to do their reading and learn about everything. And then next up, I'm going to invite Professor Ciara Torres-Spelliscy. I hope I said that correctly. Who has been working on democracy issues for a long time and has a new book coming out November 5th. So welcome, Ciara.
Okay. Hello. My name is Ciara Torres-Spelliscy. I know it's a mouthful, and I'm going to talk about my new book, Corporatocracy. So let me tell you a story about a political party. When the scene opens, the political party is broke. And they are so in debt that they are worried that they're going to have to disband. So what does a political party do when they are out of money, especially in a context where there are no contribution limits and dark money is allowed? Well, they turn to the richest people in their society and they ask for money. And that is precisely what our group did. They decide to have a secret meeting and they invite the titans of industry to the meeting. And then the leader of the political party talks to the leaders of industry and says, private enterprise cannot be maintained in the age of democracy. The leader continues, we must first gain complete power if we want to crush the other side completely. And then ominously says, now we stand before the last election. And after hearing this anti-democratic screed, these business leaders fork over millions in dark money. And then suddenly our political party is no longer in the red, they are in the black, and they can proceed with their plans. And that was the last free election for over 15 years. And this is a true story. Some of the business leaders who were at that meeting included Alfred Krupp and Gustav Krupp. They were the leaders of the Krupp Corporation. Then there was Frederick Flick, who is the head of the Flick concern. and Karl Crouch, who was the head of IG Farben. Now, if you're unfamiliar with IG Farben, you probably recognize one of their surviving subsidiaries, which is Bayer. They were a chemical company, and at the time, they made everything from Bayer aspirin to Zyklon B, the gas that was used in the gas chambers. And so, if you haven't figured this out yet, the party I was talking about was the German Nazi Party in 1933. The speaker at that meeting was Adolf Hitler. And the industrialist that I just named ended up at the dock in Nuremberg, accused of war crimes. So this is an image from the Krupp Tribunal. This is an image from the Farben Tribunal. This is an image from the Flick Tribunal. So all of that is nearly 100 years ago and thousands of miles away. So let's think about our own context. So I want to be clear that I am not accusing any American political party of being akin to the Nazis. However, I do really worry about when greed and power intersect. So in our last federal election, these were the biggest political spenders. And I put a little asterisk next to Sam Bankman-Fried's name because that 38 million, I think, is misleading. So, and the reason why I say this is Sam Bankman-Fried was charged with various campaign finance crimes. And by the time we get to his superseding indictment, it is clear that what the government alleges is that he spent $100 million of illegal corporate contributions. And you could ask, why is he doing this? So according to his prosecutors, he was doing this to curry favor with people in Washington so that they would pass favorable legislation to his particular type of cryptocurrency. And he was shopping around a piece of legislation before he was indicted. Now, you may know the end of the story. Sam Bankman-Fried is now a guest of the state. He is there for 25 years, but strangely not for campaign finance crimes. If we have time later, I'll explain exactly why that is. But how do these two narratives intersect? What is my nightmare scenario? So we clearly have an audience for anti-democratic ideas here in the United States. And I think we were really fortunate that there was relatively little corporate sponsorship of January 6th. And so my nightmare scenario is that the next Sam Bankman-Fried, the next billionaire, teams up with anti-democratic politicians, and that we might not be so lucky when power and greed intersect if there's major corporate sponsorship of the next January 6th. And that's what I deal with in this book. I try to grapple with that clearly and fairly and bring lots of receipts. So thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the time.
Wow, Prof. Ciara. Sorry, I was mispronouncing your name.
No worries.
I can't wait to read this book. And it's truly frightening when power and greed, the visuals you have are just phenomenal. And we really need to be aware and talk about, why we need to vote for our democracy, to protect our democracy. Our whole campaign is about getting out voters for each of our topics to hold people accountable so that we can create the future we want. Well, thank you. And then next up, we have Cindy Black from Fix Democracy First, who's been doing amazing work in Washington State. I was working with her years ago with WAMEND and passing the Overturned Citizens United Act back then. And now they've been doing just continuing great work. And she also hosts weekly chats about democracy on Wednesday nights, which will be ongoing. Ours are just each week now through the election, but I really encourage people to join Cindy's weekly chat. So with that, I welcome Cindy Black.
Thanks, Holly. Thanks for inviting me. As Holly mentioned, I'm the executive director of Fix Democracy First. We're based in Washington State. And as many of you know, a lot of the work happens on a state level before we can get it passed on a federal level, which really helps a lot. So we focus our work mostly in Washington state, though we do support a lot of federal legislation. As Holly mentioned, we were able to pass a statewide ballot initiative back in 2016, calling for the reversal of Citizens United. And as John mentioned, we were able to pass the ban foreign influence corporations in Seattle back in January of 2020. We are working on that on a state level. We have a meeting with our House sponsor next week, so we're hoping to get that reintroduced in the state house and move that forward. Many of the other things we work on, one of those things is money in politics is not it's very popular with the public, but it's very difficult to get legislators to change it because it influences how they can raise money. And that's been a really difficult uphill battle. So we work on a lot of different levels to try to do that. We are limited by the Citizens United decision and what we actually can do. One of the things we tried to do in Seattle was to limit, independent expenditure campaigns. And unfortunately, that piece of the legislature got moved out. But there's things we can do. We can still do disclosure, though on many levels, some people are trying to get rid of that as well. And on a federal level, the Federal Election Commission has not been holding people accountable like they should. There's been a lot of gridlock there. But one of the things we've been successful with in Seattle, and we're trying to get this on a statewide level, is public funding of elections. The Seattle Democracy Voucher Program has been in existence for almost 10 years now. It passed back in 2015, which gives 4 $25 vouchers to all eligible residents in the city of Seattle to donate to candidates of their choice. It's been very successful. We've seen an increase in it makes everybody a potential donor. It forces candidates to get out there and talk to everybody because they don't have to just rely on big money. It also enables people to run for office that could never be able to afford to run for office otherwise because they don't have deep money connections. The levy renewal, it's funded by a levy, and it's an 8%, I'm sorry, a very small percentage. It averages about $8 per property owner in the city of Seattle, but it's up for renewal next year. So we're busily trying to get the city council to refer it to the ballot next year because voters have to vote on it every 10 years to approve that. And we are preparing for another ballot initiative in case they don't refer it to the ballot. The other thing that is really important is I mentioned disclosure. In Washington state, we have some of the best disclosure laws. We have the Public Disclosure Commission, and you can look up any candidate or campaign and find out where the money's coming in. So that really helps people know, especially reporters and people that investigate that, to be able to share with the public what's really going on, who's funding a campaign, and get behind it. But we need to continue this work. It's ongoing. As you know, in California, you're doing a whole lot of work with Movi and the work you're doing there. Same here in Washington state. Luckily, we were able to recently just form a new coalition. It's just a little over a year and a half old. People Powered Elections Washington. We're able to work together with many organizations in the state, including the Washington Bus, Washington Community Alliance, League of Women Voters, Washington Conservation Action, and a variety of other organizations to help tackle money in elections in a variety of ways. And we're always looking for new opportunities of how can we address that. As I mentioned, we're trying to do things on a state level. We're trying to get the foreign influence corporation ban happening statewide, as well as a democracy voucher program for legislative positions in the state. So a lot of work continues. It's ongoing, but it's great to work with. I see a lot of familiar faces on the call. We work closely with John and Free Speech for People, Holly and Michelle, and in their work and supporting their efforts in California. And so it's going to take a lot of us to keep pushing this forward, but campaign finance reform is very popular with the public, and we need to do ways to really get more public support for these type of reforms on a state level as well as a federal level. And yes, join our weekly democracy happy hour on Wednesdays. We cover a variety of different democracy related topics. I also cover democracy headlines in the news. I'll put a link in the chat to that if you want to sign up to join that. Tomorrow night, we're going to be talking about the recent Supreme Court rulings that have happened over this session and kind of break those down a little bit. So, but thank you for all the work that you're all doing as well.
Thank you, Cindy. This is very helpful. Great information. And I wanted, before we go to our Q&A, you guys can start thinking of the questions you might have. I just want to share a 1-minute video about our campaign and then let everybody know about the Spark the Vote social media and film challenge we have for September 15th. So hold on.
I vote for women's choice because we need autonomy over our own bodies. Why do you vote?
I vote because democracy is an important part of the American spirit. Why do you vote?
I vote because the people who came before me made so many sacrifices to make my vote count. And that's why I vote. Why do you vote?
I vote because I want kids to be safe at school. Why do you vote?
I vote because of marriage equality. Why do you vote?
For our environment, to hear our planet, to hear your rights, to hear for everything. So that's the reason I vote. Why do you vote?
I vote because I believe in universal health care for all. Why do you vote?
I vote because I care about marriage equality and people exercising their rights. Why do you vote?
I vote because action is the antidote to despair. Why do you vote?
VOTEE.
And I'm also excited to share that we have this for the Spark the Vote social media and film challenge. What's going to be the weekend of September 14th, which is just ahead of National Voter Registration Day. So the idea is to get creatives across the country excited to participate, make these videos on social media, share them, and get people to talk about these issues. Obviously, money in politics really intersects with a lot of the issues. We're not getting the change we need because the money is influencing some of the votes. And I'm super, so people can make films on each of the issues. I'm excited to share, we actually have a $5,000 cash prize for the best video on getting big money out of politics. And we also have a $5,000 award for the best video on the Supreme Court and any of these issues. So if this inspires you, please spread the word. And as you saw, the videos can be as simple as, write your vote, write your script. Choose one of our issues, I vote for, speak from your heart, and then end with why do you vote? But we also, for the contest, the awards are going to go to ones that are much more creative and really looking into the issue. But, people can do a lot in one weekend, and we hope that you join us for that event. So with that, let's get to the Q&As. Do people have any questions specific for anybody, for everybody across the board? Please raise your hand or write them in the chat. Michelle, I saw your hand.
Yeah, all right. I have so many questions, but let me just start with John for a sec. One of the things, as you know, in our effort to pass the Get Foreign Money Out of California Elections Act was legislators wrongly, in our opinion, hiding behind the idea that, it's unconstitutional. And so I have two questions on that. One is, obviously we want to disabuse them of that notion going forward. And one of the ways we'd like to do that is with Senator Whitehouse's help. I believe I read within the last month or so that Senator Whitehouse was going to introduce this bill into the Senate. Is that still
I'm not able to comment today.
okay?
Question.
All right. I did think that it had gone out in an email, which is why I bring it up. And my sort of in connection to the court case, there was a challenge in Minnesota, and last I heard, oral arguments were scheduled for October. Is that still the schedule?
I believe so, but let me just actually back up on the broader point you're making, Michelle, which is an important one around claims that this model legislation is unconstitutional. So as I said in my opening remarks, this model legislation is based on existing Supreme Court precedent in Bloom v. FEC, which already has upheld a longstanding federal prohibition that bars foreign nationals from spending money in any elections in the United States. The only area of federal campaign finance law that dictates not just whether foreign nationals can spend money in federal elections, which they cannot, but also dictates whether they can spend them in state and local elections. Most of the time, when Congress passes the law, it leaves to the states and localities the questions of what they want to do with their own elections on money and politics. But here, in fact, this law dictates for the entire country that foreign nationals have no role in any election in the U.S. And that's significant. And that Supreme Court ruling upholding that longstanding prohibition is significant as well. So we rely heavily on that precedent to make the case that this model legislation also preserves American self-government like that existing law does and must be upheld. Now, neither Seattle nor San Jose have been sued. There's been no challenge brought there. It's existing law in both of those jurisdictions. In Minnesota, the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, which of course represents major multinational corporations operating in Minnesota, they have sued there to try to block the enforcement of the state law that was passed and signed by the governor. And the district court, a federal district court, a Trump appointee, did in fact issue a preliminary injunction that bars the enforcement temporarily while this case moves forward toward trial. And so it's not a merit-based ruling. It's a ruling that's preliminary, based without the evidence before the court on all the basis for the constitutionality of it. It has no bearing on other states. It's a district court ruling. And that's why we see other states still proceeding with moving this legislation, including most recently the Pennsylvania House of Representatives vote. So I think that we're going to have to see ultimately where that case goes, but we are vigorously helping to defend it alongside the Minnesota Attorney General's office. And it is distinguishable from Citizens United. It is a red herring, frankly, to argue, as the judge argued in the Minnesota case, that corporate free speech rights are at stake. You know, Justice Kennedy, writing for the majority in Citizens United, discussed corporations as associations of citizens. Now, we take issue with that description. They're not actually just associations of citizens. They are, in fact, are state-based entities with privileges that we as human beings do not have, limited liability, perpetual life, etc. But even assuming, arguendo, that you accept that Justice Kennedy's description is correct, well, then an association of citizens does not include foreign investors because they are not citizens of the United States. They do not have First Amendment rights to spend money in our elections. So just that alone should make people understand this is distinguished from Citizens United. Citizens United did not say anything about foreign investment in our elections. And in fact, when President Obama criticized the Supreme Court for this ruling in his State of the Union address weeks after it issued that, saying that it would lead to foreign influence in elections, Justice Alito famously broke decorum in that session of Congress and shook his head and mouthed the words "not true." Well, President Obama's prediction has proven to be true, and that's why we need this model legislation.
Thank you, John. I know I have a lot of questions about some of the recent Supreme Court rulings and also the influence of money on some of the Supreme Court justices. I don't know if anybody would like to take their take as legal experts on what is going on and what can we do to
And can I add a tag onto that question, Holly, which is have people thought about what's the most effective way to message the electorate about this threat? And also, where's the hope here? Is it getting a Congress that will expand the court and maybe talk about John and Ciara, the ways in which we might actually fix the court?
So I think one effective message is that there are 70-year-old or plus justices, and the oldest is Sam Alito and Thomas. And so I think the next president is probably going to have 2 to 3 appointments. And I think people should really think about, do they want Donald Trump to have 3 more appointments, or would they rather have the Democrats have those 3 appointments? Because I think that's really clarifying, because we've seen what comes out of a 6-3 conservative Supreme Court, including this recent presidential immunity decision, which is, as a technical legal term, bonkers. Like, it is just a little bit off. It makes the president above the law, which we've never had until a week ago. And I think it really shocked people.
I agree with all that. I would just add, the Supreme Court faces a crisis of legitimacy right now. This corruption is unprecedented. And this is why a couple months ago, we launched a campaign, SCOTUSReformNow.org, where we are making a series of demands with respect to reforming the Supreme Court. Number one, we're demanding that the Senate Judiciary Committee do its job, led by Chairman Dick Durbin, a senator from Illinois, to investigate fully this corruption of the Supreme Court. That includes issuing a subpoena that it has yet to issue against Harlan Crow, who's a major billionaire backer of Justice Thomas. It includes seeking the enforcement of a subpoena they've issued to Leonard Leo, the head of the Federal Society, which has stacked the court and funneled tons of money in lavish gifts, undisclosed, to these justices. And yet he has decided he's not even going to comply with that subpoena. Some people go to jail for that, including Steve Bannon, who's now in jail, but somehow Leonard Leo, they're not yet even seeking to enforce it. So that's number one. Number two, we are calling for the impeachment of Justices Thomas, Alito, and Kavanaugh, all of whom have engaged in abuses of power and should not be on this court. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez just last week said she would seek impeachment proceedings against certain justices. Stay tuned on that. And then third, we are calling for the expansion of the Supreme Court. There's a bill in Congress, the Judiciary Act, which we fully endorse along with many others. So it would add 4 new seats to the court. And finally, we believe there must be vigorous and strong ethics reform of this court. There must be a way to ensure that justices who have clear conflicts of interest are removed from cases where they have those interests. And it should not be a voluntary decision. No other judge in the federal system, other than the justices, faces this kind of lax enforcement of any kind of code of ethics. And yet that's what we have out of this current court.
And I'll just add that, yeah, it's unbelievable that the highest court does not have a code of ethics. That's ridiculous. We really need that. And I also want to mention we need to pay attention what's happening on this with the state level and the state courts. A lot of money getting dumped into those races that are having huge impact on a state level. And we need to pay attention to the money getting poured into these state races and the state Supreme Courts, as well as on the federal level.
Yeah.
That's a great point. Very great point.
To John's point about Senator Durbin, it's been so disappointing to hear him say, well, we don't have the votes, and why would we even do that? I don't understand why they don't look at the show hearings that Republicans hold that, flame all kinds of coverage and right. And what's his hesitation about using one of the tools that he has?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more, Michelle. The oversight powers that the Senate Judiciary Committee and the other committees have in Congress include holding hearings, putting people under oath, issuing subpoenas, regardless of whether there's an ability to pass a bill, a piece of legislation now under this current Congress. They have a duty to investigate this matter, and that's precisely their job. And at this point, frankly, it's not just Leonard Alito and Harlan Crow. Justices Alito, his wife Martha Ann Alito, Justice Roberts, all were aware of these insurrectionist flags, or at least the one flying outside their home in Virginia, prior to the inauguration of President Biden, when there was still a case challenging the 2020 election. There he is flying an upside down flag that supports the January 6th insurrection and the massive fraud claims that were totally a lie about the 2020 election. So they need to be brought before the Senate Judiciary Committee. And of course, Justice Thomas and his wife, Ginny Thomas, who played a direct role in the Stop the Steal movement, need to be brought before the committee. This is not rocket science. I mean, this is exactly why we have these congressional committees. They're supposed to engage in this oversight. So it is really not an explanation worthy of anyone in the Senate to claim that they have no reason to hold a hearing or even hold an investigation of this.
Well, and all of those folks engaging in support of an insurrection and the various other crimes, this isn't stuff that voters hear about without help. So I don't know, have you suggestions about how we make a noise about this? What will anything move Senator Durbin to do this? I mean, I know his colleague, Senator Whitehouse, is certainly trying to move him. But
well, we're actually, we're right now in the middle of a week of action with Indivisible and other allies around the country. And this week of action, the week of July 8th, we're calling on people all across the country to call their senators in their own states to demand that the Senate Judiciary Committee do its job, and to call Senator Durbin and urge that he do his job as well. So that's happening literally this week, and we welcome people joining this fight.
John, if you have any email, blast copy that you could share with Holly and me, we'll get a blast out to our list. We can do that tomorrow.
Fantastic.
And also the link for us here on the chat for how to engage in this week of action.
Yeah, that is, I'll have to get that link to you after this call. Unfortunately, I don't have it right now with me, but we will follow up on that. Absolutely.
All right. And we'll put it in the spreadsheet for everybody.
Okay. Great.
Yeah, again, I've been trying to gather everything in the spreadsheet. So please, everyone, remember this will be here with all the links. And please add your name and info if you feel comfortable doing that. And also the Supreme Court, there was the Chevron doctrine ruling dealing with corporate, oversight last week. Could you share a little bit about what this means? What can be done? Can we look at the states to the, is there anything to be done?
Well, I can do the explanation and then we can get to the what can be done. So Chevron was a case from the Supreme Court in 1984, and it said that when a statute is ambiguous and you have an interpretation from an executive agency, courts are to defer to the executive agency's reasonable reading of the statute. That got thrown out a week ago by the Supreme Court. And that is a seismic change because now that deference to the agencies is gone, that expertise in agencies will not be listened to by courts, and courts are going to make an independent determination whether particular regulations are within the statutory grant that Congress has given, which is going to give federal judges enormous power and will give the Supreme Court in particular enormous power to determine what regulations we're going to have going forward. And this is sort of an open invitation to corporations who don't like this or that regulation out there, whether it's environmental or OSHA, think of it, it's all on the table again. they have an incentive to sue again and say, we don't like this regulation, and try to get it knocked out by a federal judge.
Yeah, I would just add to that Congressman Morell has already announced that he is drafting a constitutional amendment to overturn this ruling. Now we know the challenge with passing a constitutional amendment, but I think it's an important fight that needs to be waged now, just like the fight to overturn Citizens United and frankly other Supreme Court rulings. This one is critically needed because it does effectively eviscerate the ability of these regulatory agencies to act in the appropriate way they're set up to protect the public interest.
Thank you. I have two more questions about the Supreme Court because there's been a lot happening here. The other one first is, and all of this is how can we get back to voting and putting the message out to people that this is so important this year to vote. Vote for Justice is on the ballot, even if not directly. First of all, what's happened with gerrymandering, there's been a lot of back and forth gerrymandering laws. And then to end, I'd also love to talk about, women's autonomy, women's bodily autonomy is one of our issues, and voting, and how the Supreme Court put it back at the state, and then what we're seeing, and that, that clearly is, it is being on the ballot in a lot of ways, and people are going to turn out to vote for this. But those are the last two. I thought I'd just cue them up, and then also if anybody else has other questions. So thank you.
Well, I can say in my home state of Florida, we, as Floridian women, up until a couple of months ago, bodily autonomy was protected under the state's constitution, not just under Roe v. Wade. And so when Dobbs knocked out Roe v. Wade, that then became a reason for the Florida legislature to pass harsher and harsher abortion bans. Those bans were challenged under the Florida Constitution, and the Florida Constitution did something very similar to what the U.S. Supreme Court, the Florida Supreme Court did something very similar to the what the U.S. Supreme Court did in Dobbs. They ignored their own precedent. So if they were being faithful to their own precedent, then they would have upheld the right of privacy under the state constitution, and it would have protected the right to choose. But instead, they did the exact opposite, and they decided, no, there's no more right to privacy in the Florida Constitution that covers a right to choose. But the same day that they made that decision, they also said that a abortion rights amendment could go to the Florida voters. So the good news is in many states, including the state of Florida, the right to abortion is actually on the ballot, and that may drive turnout. Also, adult marijuana use is also on the ballot in Florida. So I think between those two issues being on the ballot, you may have more people turn out than you would if it was just Trump and Biden.
Yeah.
Cindy, do you want to add anything before I go on this one?
No, I just believe that, there's so much work we need to do. I do want to mention, though, I just read that abortion will most likely be on the ballot in 11 different states. And every time it's been on the ballot, it's passed with a huge support. So that may be motivating to get people out this year.
It does need a supermajority in Florida to actually become part of our Constitution. So it's an uphill battle. We have to get to 60%, but I think it's doable.
We actually have, we just had a call about women's autonomy and talked about this June 25th. And actually, Monet from Florida Rising is going to be on our call August 13th about women voting for women's autonomy. So we'll get the latest from her if you want to join our Tuesday, August 13th call. I love that we're trying to bring the intersectionality of all of these issues and the importance of voting to people, because they are, we are all complex beings who vote for many things. And
Right.
we do have a list that it was on the ballot for 5 states so far and 8 potential more. And we'll get updates as we go.
Yeah, and Cindy, if you could find where you read about the 11, because that may be the most recent.
Yeah, I'll put the link in the chat.
Thank you.
Yeah,
So the only other thing I would just add to this particular point is that on our SCOTUS Reform Now website, we discuss the corruption associated with the fraudulent use of the originalism theory. And Dobbs is a good example of that corruption. The court likes to try to claim when they make these kinds of rulings that they're solely looking at the text of the Constitution. There was no right to privacy back at the time of the framers drafting the Constitution. Therefore, from an originalist perspective, this 50+ year precedent needs to be overturned and stripping rights all over the country, the freedom to make reproductive choices on people's own. So that's where we go with that kind of corruption. But in reality, when you look at the way the court applies that theory, they don't apply it consistently. In Trump v. Anderson, which was the case dealing with Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, clear language of that part of the Constitution saying that if you've engaged in insurrection after having taken an oath of office, you're forever barred from holding public office again. 5 of those justices actually created out of thin air an exception in that provision, which doesn't exist in the text, which says that somehow now Congress must pass first enforcement legislation for it to be enforced in federal elections. So originalism gets thrown out the door when it doesn't work for their political interests, and it's used when it works for their own ideological or religious interests to advance a ruling like Dobbs. And that, we think, is just as corrupt, frankly, as the corruption of billionaires funding justices and then coming before the court with their own interests.
I also want to mention that the Republican National Committee just took off the federal ban on abortion off their platform because they realize it's so unpopular with the public. Doesn't mean that they may reverse course if they get into power again on the national level, but they are reversing course on that because it doesn't poll well for them. So I think that's more of a strategy than anything else, but it did piss off some of their anti-abortion people, but that just came out.
Now, I'd just add to that, if you have not thumbed through Project 2025, which is the blueprint of everything that Heritage Foundation wants to do in a second Trump presidency, take a little time, at least scan it. I put this off for nearly a year, and I think I was just being an ostrich with my head in the sand. And I had a speaking engagement that's coming up, and I knew that people were going to ask me about it. So I was like, okay, I have to read this thing. It is horrifying. It is just horrifying. Whether it's reproductive health or getting rid of the Department of Education, stopping tracking of race with respect to hiring, so you can no longer do disparate impact lawsuits. Almost every bad decision that could be put forward is in this document, and it's open to the public to see. So spend a little time, thumb through Project 2025. It will motivate you to continue to fight the good fight.
May I ask a question about that? For you legal folks, I saw a campaign online on social media today pointing out the fact that the Heritage Society is 501c3, and that this clearly breaks the stipulation that 501c3 organizations must not engage in political activity. Is that a spurious argument, or do you think that has legs?
I mean, it's issue-oriented, not candidate-oriented.
Depends if it's being coordinated in any way with a political campaign. I think that would be the evidence that would be needed. If it's actually,
I think the list of 30 authors might have 30 of the former
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I think that's a fair question. I mean, I will say I'm coming to this conversation very much in a nonpartisan perspective, so I can't affiliate myself with comments that may appear partisan on this conversation, but this is, a very important line that has to be drawn for 501(c)(3) organizations like ours, that we cannot engage in any kind of electoral activity. So I do think if the Heritage Foundation is coordinating in any way with the political campaign, then I think it's problematic and they ought to be investigated for it.
Thank you.
You brought up a good point about coordination. There's been ways that candidates and campaigns get around that. It's called red boxing. They put little red boxes around things on their website that they want people to focus on. So there's ways that people always working to try to get around existing law. And it's up to us to continue to look for that and bring attention to it. And I did put a link if you want to read the full 2025 project, which is frightening.
It's over 900 pages.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
It's a lot.
But I put a link in the chat if you actually have time, you want to read what they're talking about. But it's really bad
And amazing that they put it on paper.
Yeah.
Oh
Wow.
yeah, they're
Wow.
really blatant about it. They're Trump has come out and said that, oh no, he has nothing to do with it, but it's written for him. I mean, it has his name all over the website. It's just false. It's really about also spreading more. If, in particular, if he gets into power, how do you to give him more power in that role, like getting rid of anybody that doesn't align with him out of federal office. These are longtime civil servants, trying to get rid of all of them and just put all his cronies in those positions. It's very frightening on all levels.
Wow.
May I ask also of Chara and John especially, now that the president has this immunity, he's a bit of a king. If you could whisper into the president's ear, is there anything, given what the Supreme Court has granted the US president, is there anything he could do to shore up democracy between now and November?
I mean, what's sort of strange about the immunity decision, well, there are lots of strange things about that decision, but it immunizes the president's core constitutional powers from criminal prosecution. And this is an absolute immunity. So what that means is if you can open Article 2 of the Constitution and find enumerated powers for the president, so that he's the commander in chief, that he has the pardon power, that he appoints ambassadors. Those are all core powers that are now immunized under this ruling, but it's immunized from criminal prosecution. And one of the things that is not a core presidential power is running federal elections. That is given to the US states, to the Congress to count electoral college votes, and very in a minute way to the vice president who opens and helps count the electoral college votes. But the president, one of his core powers is not running federal elections. I mean, John and I might get into a very interesting discussion about what the take care clause means now. But it's I think the frustrating thing for those of us who would want presidential power to be used for broadening elections is that it is, I think, in some ways not entirely addressed by this opinion.
I think that's a very important point. And I would just add to it that I think it is very possible that we are going to see a hearing or mini trial prior to this election that Judge Chutkan in District of Columbia oversees on the evidence that the special counsel Jack Smith has on the crimes that Donald Trump committed trying to overturn the 2020 election and how they are not official acts. So while I agree this decision is an outrage, it totally upends centuries of precedent, making clear that no one is above the law. Nevertheless, with respect to Donald Trump, who's obviously the defendant in this particular case, there is going to potentially be an airing of the evidence before the federal court on this in a way that they will try to block and do everything they can to delay, but it may not be delayed before the election.
That would be wonderful.
Wow, thank you. Well, we are at time, everyone. This was such a powerful conversation. I really appreciate your time, wisdom, insight, being on the pulse of this. And I hope people come back. This is being recorded, so you could share it. And I hope you come back for more of our Tuesday calls. We are getting the latest information on each of our issues from top, amazing people such as John, Ciara, and Cindy. Thank you. And have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you. And John, get us some language for a blast, if you would.
Yes, right away. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.